June 1757. The air over Bengal hung heavy with rain. Monsoon clouds gathered like a ceiling of smoke above the flat green fields. And from the east came the low roll of thunder, the sound that, to those waiting near the village of Plassey, felt indistinguishable from the beat of war drums. Beneath those clouds stood a few thousand men in red coats, merchants turned soldiers, commanded not by a monarch or a general, but by a corporation. The East India Company had come to trade, yet on this day it prepared to conquer. The British in Bengal had no divine right, no national commission. They held charters, not banners. Their forts were warehouses. Their soldiers, accountants with muskets. But years of anxiety had turned commerce into something sharper. Competition with the French for the riches of Bengal, the jewel of the Mughal world, had drawn the company into politics, and politics into war. To protect their profits, they built walls, raised armies, and purchased loyalty in the courts of Indian princes. Each act of self-preservation pushed them closer to empire. By the summer of 1757, that tension had reached breaking point. The young Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had driven the British from Calcutta, enraged by their arrogance and expansion. His troops had captured the company's fort, and in the chaos that followed, British prisoners died in the stifling dark of a prison cell that would pass into legend as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Outrage swept through Britain's trading settlements. But beneath the fury was fear. Fear that British trade in the East might collapse entirely. The company decided it could no longer afford to merely trade. It had to rule. Across the Indian Ocean, a single ship carried the man who would lead that transformation, Robert Clive. He was not born a general. He was born restless. A failed student and near suicide in his youth, Clive had once joined the company as a lowly clerk. Yet, in India, he found a kind of destiny. In a place where rank mattered less than resolve, he became a soldier, and then a leader. Now, returning to Bengal, he came not for vengeance, but for security, to restore the company's power and to protect its profits. The historian in us may call it empire, but to Clive, it was a necessity. In Calcutta, he rebuilt what had been lost. He reorganized defenses, negotiated alliances, and reforged the company's battered spirit. The line between trader and conqueror blurred with every order he gave. The drums of war began not on the battlefield, but in the counting houses and boardrooms of London, where directors spoke of investment, even as they authorized an invasion. When Clive's army marched north through Bengal's flooded fields, it was less an army than a statement of intent. Just 3,000 men, a third of them Europeans, the rest Indian sepoys trained in British discipline. They carried with them not the prestige of empire, but the quiet terror of being vastly outnumbered. Siraj's forces numbered more than 50,000, supported by French artillery, and commanded by nobles who believed victory was already assured. Yet beneath the splendor of the Nawab's court, the soil was rotting. His nobles resented him. His generals whispered against him. In the palaces of Murshidabad, gold exchanged hands in secret. The British had learned that to rule India, one need not outfight her princes, only outbid them. As the monsoon broke, Clive paused near the village of Plassey, a small patch of mango groves beside the river Bhagirathi. The rain fell in sheets, the ground turning to mud underfoot. British soldiers, soaked and hungry, cleaned their muskets and prayed their gunpowder would hold. Across the river, the Nawab's vast army gathered, elephants draped in silk, cavalry stretching beyond sight, cannon lined in gleaming rows. On paper it was no contest, but Clive knew that the battle had already begun. Not on the field, but in the mind. He had spent weeks corresponding with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's most senior generals, promising wealth and title in exchange for betrayal. The ink on those secret letters would decide the future of Bengal far more than any musket or cannon shot. The coming clash, then, was less a duel of armies than a duel of intentions, between a prince defending his throne and a company fighting for its survival. For the British soldiers who waited through that wet June night, there was no talk of empire. They were merchants' men, clerks, sailors, and adventurers, each wondering how far from home they had come, and for what. Many did not yet grasp that they stood at a turning point in history, that when dawn broke, and the drums of Bengal rolled across the fields, they would not merely fight for trade, but unknowingly plant the seed of an empire. The thunder grew closer. Somewhere across the darkness, the Nawab's campfires burned like stars on the horizon. Between them lay a few miles of open field, and the fate of India's richest province. In that space, power itself was about to change hands, from the splendor of a native court to the cold calculations of a private company. Sometimes, the birth of an empire begins not with power, but with desperation, and in that desperation, in the rain-soaked dawn at Plassey, a new kind of British ambition would be born, one that would trade the ledger for the sword. The rain had not yet lifted from the fields of Bengal when Robert Clive began to move. Mud clung to the boots of soldiers and to the wheels of cannon as they trundled north through the drenched landscape, a small procession of red coats and sepoys that looked more like a merchant convoy than an army. Clive rode at its head, silent, watchful, his uniform streaked with earth. The clerk who had once loathed his own life now commanded men whose fates hung on his decisions. Something within him had hardened, not ambition, but control. He was by nature neither diplomat nor gentleman. Clive's power came from discipline, the kind learned not in courtrooms or academies, but in the lonely heat of the Indian plains. The company's men followed him because he was one of them, a survivor of misfortune, a product of opportunity. He understood their hunger. They had crossed oceans not for glory, but for silver. Sailors, merchants, discharged soldiers, and desperate adventurers who had traded the streets of London for the promise of Bengal. In their hands, the musket was not a symbol of patriotism, but of employment. Yet under Clive, this fragile band began to behave like an army. He taught them that to endure was victory in itself. "Obedience," he once said to his officers, "is worth more than courage." They obeyed because he embodied something the company's directors in London never could: conviction. The further they marched, the more the British discovered that war in India was not won by force, but by persuasion. The Mughal world was one of courtiers and intrigue, where loyalties shifted like sandbanks in the river. Here, a general's triumph depended not on the number of his cannon, but on the weight of his promises. Clive learned to speak that language with chilling fluency. Gold moved faster than gunpowder. Treaties killed more surely than bullets. Mir Jafar, commander of the Nawab's forces, was his greatest test. The man was proud, ambitious, and dangerously uncertain of his place. Clive understood him at once, for he too was a man who wished to be more than what fortune had made him. Their correspondence grew into a conspiracy, promises of rule, of wealth, of a Bengal remade under new masters. It was not courage that changed the fate of nations that summer. It was a letter sealed in wax and carried through the rain. In Calcutta, company officials watched the campaign unfold with growing awe and unease. Theirs was a trading venture, not an empire, yet Clive's victories were transforming their ledgers into manifestos of power. Every dispatch spoke not of profits, but of provinces, not of cargo, but of kingdoms. What began as an effort to secure trade had turned into something unrecognizable, a political creature disguised as commerce. The moral line between defense and domination had blurred almost to invisibility. The men around Clive, administrators, interpreters, agents of influence, sensed this transformation. They dined together beneath canvas awnings, eating by the dim light of oil lamps while rain drummed on the fabric above. Their talk mixed prophet and prophecy. If the company could command one province, why not two? If one Nawab could be replaced, why not many? Each new calculation made conquest seem less outrageous, more inevitable. For Clive himself, the change ran deeper. He had begun his life in India as a servant of trade, but now he moved through the world as if he were shaping it. His letters reveal a man increasingly convinced of his own purpose, yet never at peace with it. "I am astonished," he wrote later, "at my own moderation." Those words, half ironic and half sincere, expose the paradox at the heart of imperial power, the belief that restraint, not conquest, was its virtue. He knew he was not conquering for king or country, but for a corporation. Yet, to survive within that hypocrisy, he learned to think of domination as duty. His soldiers fought not for a flag, but for a wage. He fought not for the nation, but for order, his order. In that strange alliance between commerce and command, the modern empire was being born. When Clive's column reached the outskirts of Murshidabad, the capital of Bengal, the city shimmered in the damp heat, domes and palaces rising from the mist like a mirage. Within those walls, Siraj-ud-Dawla still believed himself master of his realm. But already, unseen, his fate had been purchased. Clive's agents had spread coins and promises through the Nawab's court like seeds in fertile soil. By the time his troops encamped near Plassey, the British had more allies in the Nawab's army than enemies. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a defense of trade had become an art of manipulation, a campaign waged with paper and whispers. The British had not yet fired a single shot in the decisive Battle of Plassey, but they had already begun to win it. Every empire begins with someone who learns how to buy loyalty before commanding it. And as the fields of Bengal steamed beneath the monsoon sun, Clive had already purchased the most dangerous weapon of all, the human will to betray. The rains had thinned, leaving Bengal's skies heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. In the palaces of Murshidabad, beneath ceilings painted with gold and turquoise, a young prince struggled to hold his world together. Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal, sat on a throne that shimmered in splendor, but shook with doubt. Around him, courtiers bowed low, their smiles too polished, their loyalties too thin. He was 24, proud, impetuous, and increasingly isolated. The empire he had inherited was an empire already decaying. Bengal was the richest province of the Mughal world, a land of silk, rice, and riverine wealth. But by the time Siraj came to power, the old Mughal order was collapsing into fragments. Nawabs like him ruled in name, but power was splintered among merchants, generals, and foreign traders who played Indian politics like a game of chess. The British and the French both courted Bengal's favor. They came speaking of trade, but brought with them the machinery of conquest, fortifications, cannons, and contracts written in a language of advantage. Siraj inherited a throne hemmed in by deceit. His grandfather, Alivardi Khan, had kept a fragile peace by balancing European interests. Siraj, young and impulsive, lacked that patience. He distrusted the foreigners, and not without reason. The British East India Company had been fortifying its settlements at Calcutta, defying the Nawab's authority. When he ordered them to stop, they refused. What began as a dispute over trade became a question of sovereignty. In the spring, Siraj's forces captured Calcutta with remarkable speed. He entered the British fort as victor, and for a moment, it seemed the authority of Bengal had been restored. But what followed destroyed that triumph. In the chaos of victory, prisoners were confined overnight in a small airless room, and by dawn, many were dead. The incident, later branded in British memory as the Black Hole of Calcutta, became propaganda, fuel for vengeance. For Siraj, it was the beginning of the end. As British ships returned under Clive's command, carrying soldiers and cannon, Siraj's court dissolved into panic. Ministers whispered that the British were merely traders, that they could be bought off. Generals assured him their loyalty was firm. But beneath their vows lay letters to Clive, sealed with the promise of gold. Siraj's personality made him vulnerable to precisely such intrigue. He was temperamental, fiercely proud, and known for punishing betrayal with sudden rage. His anger frightened his allies, who began to plot their survival. One of them was Mir Jafar, the commander of his army. Another was Jagat Seth, Bengal's most powerful banker, who feared the Nawab's volatility more than foreign conquest. To them, British dominance seemed preferable to chaos. The French, too, watched from their base at Chandernagore, offering advice, arms, and ambiguous friendship. They whispered that the British were overextended, that Siraj could crush them if he acted swiftly. But hesitation, that most human of weaknesses, began to rot his command. He delayed, sought counsel, and suspected everyone. In the corridors of his palace, the Nawab's footsteps echoed through silence thick with treachery. When his spies brought news that Mir Jafar might be in contact with Clive, Siraj confronted him. The general swore loyalty before the court, pressing his hand to the Quran, but his eyes told another story. The young Nawab dismissed his doubts, yet that moment would cost him a kingdom. Outside the capital, the company's forces were advancing through the monsoon haze. Their discipline, their European artillery, their strange mix of soldiers, Indian and British fighting side by side, unnerved Siraj's officers. "They are not soldiers," one courtier warned. "They are merchants who fight like machines." To Siraj, this defied comprehension. War had always been a matter of honor, of elephants and banners. Now it was being decided by contracts and coins. As June wore on, Siraj found himself trapped between two worlds: the decaying grandeur of Mughal ceremony and the cold efficiency of European ambition. He longed to trust someone, a general, a minister, even his French advisors, but could trust no one. At night, he walked the terraces of his palace, staring out over the dark river. Somewhere beyond its bend, the British were gathering. His court still glittered, music, perfume, and laughter echoing through the marble halls. Yet every smile masked calculation. When he summoned his commanders for council before the coming battle, Mir Jafar stood at his side, bowing with perfect deference. Only Siraj's grandmother, the formidable Ghaseti Begum, dared to tell him the truth. "You are surrounded by traitors," she warned. But even she could not pierce the web that already bound them. By the time the Nawab's army camped at Plassey, its fate was sealed. His forces were immense, 50,000 strong, yet hollow within. The French contingent manned their guns with diligence, but the heart of the army was uncertain. Orders went unheeded, discipline crumbled, and rumors spread faster than messengers. Siraj rode through his camp in silence, sensing that something vast and invisible had turned against him. When dawn broke over the mango groves, the drums began to beat. Across the field, Clive's smaller force stood in tight formation, silent and waiting. The Nawab's elephants trumpeted in the mist, and somewhere, hidden in the lines, Mir Jafar's men waited too, not to fight, but to decide the moment of their betrayal. In the collision between pride and paranoia, history forgets who was right, only who remained. And as the first cannon boomed across the fields of Plassey, Siraj-ud-Dawla, the last independent Nawab of Bengal, found himself fighting not an army, but the shadows of his own court. The morning was heavy and grey. Mist clung to the fields by the Bhagirathi River, where mango trees stood like silent witnesses to the end of an age. Beneath their branches, two armies faced each other, one vast, glittering, and uncertain, the other small, disciplined, and impossibly calm. On one side, Siraj-ud-Dawla's Bengal, 50,000 men, elephants, and cannon. On the other, Robert Clive's 3,000, a handful of British regulars, Indian sepoys, and a few pieces of field artillery half sunk in the mud. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became the birth of the empire. The first guns fired just after dawn. The Nawab's artillery roared from the high ground, each shot echoing across the river's misty surface. But the monsoon betrayed him. Rain soaked the powder, turned the ground to slurry, and muffled the thunder of his cannons. On the British side, tarpaulins kept the ammunition dry. Every discharge from their smaller guns found its mark, sharp, deliberate, almost surgical. Clive stood beneath the banyan tree, observing through his spyglass. He made no attempt to charge. He didn't need to. He knew the battle's outcome had already been written, not in strategy, but in secret correspondence. Weeks earlier, Mir Jafar and his fellow conspirators had signed an agreement promising to turn against Siraj at the decisive moment. The ink on that paper was still fresher than the blood about to be spilled. The field of Plassey. Then was less a battlefield than a theater. Its outcome choreographed in whispers. Siraj, watching from his litter, could not understand why his army hesitated. He had trusted men who now avoided his gaze. His cannons fell silent one by one, their crews abandoning positions as orders went unanswered. When he sent word for Mir Jafar to advance, no reply came. Instead, the general sat motionless, his troops idle, his intentions hidden behind a mask of obedience. Confusion spread like fire through the Nawab's ranks. Commanders argued, messengers vanished, drums beat without order. To the French advisors in the camp, it was madness. They fought stubbornly, manning their guns until overrun. But the core of the army, the men upon whom victory depended, simply stood and watched. It was not courage that decided Plassey. It was hesitation. For 3 hours, the storm and the gunfire merged into a single deafening rhythm. The British line, though outnumbered, held firm, not through superior numbers, but through discipline and nerve. When the rain ceased and the smoke lifted, the Nawab's army was disintegrating. Units began to melt away. Officers deserted. By early afternoon, the field was silent, but for the caw of crows circling above the trees. Siraj fled, first to Murshidabad, then beyond, carrying what treasure he could. Within days, he would be captured by Mir Jafar's men and executed in secret. The rebellion of pride had ended in betrayal. For Robert Clive, the triumph was staggering, and yet curiously hollow. He had fought a battle of 3 hours and won control over millions of people. But it was not a soldier's victory. It was a merchant's one. His casualties numbered fewer than 30. The true weapon had not been a musket or cannon. It had been trusted, purchased, and destroyed. When Clive entered Murshidabad days later, the palace was eerily still. He was led to the audience hall where Mir Jafar, now crowned Nawab, sat trembling on a golden throne. The man who had betrayed one master now pledged himself to another. Clive bowed with formal courtesy, but in that gesture lay the quiet understanding that the British now ruled Bengal in all but name. Around them, clerics began drafting treaties, accountants tallying indemnities, and bankers recording the new order in ledgers. The transition from sovereignty to subservience took less than a week. The company's officials calculated the spoils with the precision of auditors. 2.5 million to the army, 800,000 to the navy, 200,000 to Clive himself. Bengal's treasury, once the envy of Asia, became the seed capital of the empire. But beneath the arithmetic lay something darker. The soldiers who had fought at Plassey spoke little of bravery. Many later admitted they felt no triumph, only unease. They had seen not war, but betrayal elevated to strategy. What did honor mean in a world where victory could be bought? That question lingered long after the drums had fallen silent. The banyan tree under which Clive had stood would grow for centuries, its roots twisting through the soil that had once run with blood. The villages nearby would tell stories of the day when thunder and treachery sounded as one. Clive, too, would never fully escape the shadow of that morning. His reports to London spoke of providence and discipline, but his private letters revealed the strain of conscience. The whole affair, he confessed, was a curious mixture of politics and war. Perhaps he understood that his victory had changed more than borders. It had altered the moral fabric of British power itself. The Battle of Plassey lasted barely 3 hours, yet it dismantled a world that had stood for centuries. India's richest province passed into the hands of a company, a corporation masquerading as a government, its directors half a world away. And though Clive's name would be written in Britain's annals of glory, in Bengal it would echo differently, as the sound of a kingdom betrayed by its own heart. Victory built on betrayal leaves the victor haunted by the silence that follows. And from that silence, the machinery of the empire began to move. The guns of Plassey had fallen silent, but their echo lingered in the counting houses of Calcutta and the marble halls of Murshidabad. The battle had lasted a morning. Its consequences would last for generations. When Robert Clive entered the Nawab's palace, he walked not into a conquered kingdom, but into a treasury, a vault of unimaginable wealth. Beneath chandeliers and silk canopies lay heaps of silver, gold, jewels, and coins. This was the wealth of Bengal, the richest province of the East. And within days, it began to move, not to rebuild, but to enrich Clive's soldiers, merchants, and clerics descended upon Murshidabad in what contemporaries called a torrent of plunder. Every chest, every gem, every ingot was catalogued, loaded onto boats, and floated down the river towards Calcutta. The company took its share, the officers theirs, and the directors in London their dividend. Within a year, the value of East India Company stock had doubled on the London Exchange. Britain rejoiced. India bled. What had begun as commerce had now crossed into conquest, not through laws or annexations, but through ledgers. The new Nawab, Mir Jafar, placed on the throne by British arms, was less a ruler than a cashier. Every demand made by the company, tribute, compensation, gifts, was met through new taxes levied upon Bengal's people. Villagers who had once paid modest dues to the Mughal treasury now found themselves crushed by unprecedented levies. The company's agents called it revenue collection. To those who paid, it was survival turned into debt. In the months that followed, Bengal's economy convulsed. Merchants who had thrived under native rulers were stripped of their privileges. The powerful banking houses, the Jagat Seths, the Ghosals, the Basaks, saw their influence eroded. Trade that had once flowed freely through the ports of Hooghly and Patna now moved only under company license. British officials became partners in every venture, inspectors of every cargo, judges of every dispute. The merchant's quill had become a conqueror's sword. When Clive returned to Calcutta, he justified the seizure of Bengal's wealth as repayment for British losses, a balance restored after years of danger. But in private letters, even his allies admitted unease. One officer described a scene of rapacity unparalleled. Another warned that every man thinks only of himself and his fortune. The spoils of Plassey were not the foundations of the empire, but the intoxication of victory turned to greed. For the people of Bengal, The transformation was swift and devastating. The company's administrators, men trained to profit, not govern, began to re-engineer the province's revenues. Taxes were demanded in silver rather than grain. Failure to pay meant the auctioning of land. Fields that had fed villages for centuries were seized and sold to new landlords, many of them company clients or collaborators. Peasants who had once worked their own soil now labored under debt. The British called it reform. The people called it ruin. In the years after Plassey, prices rose, harvests failed, and the social fabric of Bengal, a network of weavers. Farmers and traders began to unravel. The looms of Murshidabad, which had once produced silk for the courts of Persia and Europe alike, fell silent. British agents seeking to monopolize the cloth trade dictated prices and demanded quotas that left artisans destitute. Many burned their own threads rather than submit. Clive himself grew uneasy. He returned to England in triumph, his fortune estimated at over $300,000, a sum that made him one of the richest men in Europe. Yet when summoned before Parliament, he faced a question Britain had never asked before. Could a company rule a nation? The inquiry into the company's actions in Bengal exposed staggering corruption. Contracts awarded to friends, extortion in the countryside, bribery institutionalized as policy. The machinery of empire had begun with corporate paperwork. Clive defended himself fiercely. "I stand astonished at my own moderation," he told Parliament, a phrase that would become both legend and indictment. But even as he spoke, famine gripped Bengal. Crops failed, taxes persisted, and the grain that might have saved villages was exported for profit. Between 1760 and 1770, millions would die, not by the sword, but by the ledger. The East India Company, meanwhile, flourished. Dividends flowed to shareholders. Fortunes were made in London drawing rooms. Bengal's rivers carried not just goods, but tribute, saltpeter, silk, sugar, and human labor, all priced and repriced in a system designed for extraction. For the first time, Britain ruled land not through royal decree, but through corporate charter. The very idea of empire was being rewritten, a dominion not of kings, but of accountants. And yet, in the quiet between ledgers and reports, some company men began to sense what had been lost. Letters from the time speak of a darkness creeping into the soul of our enterprise, of commerce turned cruel. The moral language of empire, civilization, order, progress had not yet been invented. What remained was naked profit, carried on ships that left Bengal's shores heavy with treasure and light with conscience. The gates of Bengal had not opened to governance, but to greed. What was taken in gold would return, generations later, as the moral debt of the empire. The famine, the taxes, the hollowing of a nation's heart, all began here, in the moment commerce forgot its humanity. The spoils of the empire are measured not in gold, but in hunger. And the hunger that began in Bengal would one day consume the empire itself. London awoke to the glitter of empire. The news from Bengal had crossed oceans and entered legend. A handful of men had conquered a province richer than Britain itself. The victory at Plassey was hailed in newspapers, toasted in coffee houses, and discussed in the corridors of Parliament with a mix of pride and unease. Stock prices soared, fortunes were made overnight, and the name Clive of India became synonymous with destiny. Yet beneath the applause ran a quieter current of fear, a sense that something unprecedented had occurred. A trading company, not the crown, now ruled millions. When Robert Clive returned to Britain, he was no longer the obscure clerk who had once boarded a ship for Madras. He was a millionaire, a national celebrity, and an uncomfortable mirror for his country. Crowds cheered him in the streets, but pamphleteers whispered of corruption, bribery, and blood bought by gold. Parliament itself was divided. Some saw in him the architect of British greatness, others the embodiment of its moral decay. As Clive took his seat in the House of Commons, his presence unsettled both the proud and the pious. He was not an aristocrat, not a general of the king's army, merely the servant of a corporation. Yet his influence rivaled that of ministers. The question was whispered through Westminster. Had Britain gained an empire or lost its soul? The inquiry into the East India Company's conduct began in 1722, after rumors of famine, greed, and desolation in Bengal reached home. Witnesses spoke of tax collectors wringing villages dry, of merchants reduced to beggars, of fields turned to dust. For the first time, the British public glimpsed the human cost of their distant triumph. Clive sat before the committee, pale and defiant, surrounded by ledgers and letters that charted the birth of the empire. His voice carried the mixture of pride and weariness that only men who have shaped history can know. He reminded Parliament that Bengal had been on the verge of chaos, that he had merely restored order. He insisted that his fortune was modest compared to the wealth he could have seized. "I stand astonished," he said, "at my own moderation." The line froze the chamber. To some, it sounded like the boast of a conqueror. To others, the confession of a man defending himself from guilt. Outside Parliament, the streets buzzed with caricatures of nabobs, company men returning from India in gilded carriages, their wives dripping with jewels, their servants in eastern silks. Britain's moralists saw them as a warning, evidence that wealth without virtue could corrode the nation from within. The church denounced them, poets mocked them, and reformers began to speak of Oriental corruption, infecting English life. For the first time, the empire had entered Britain's conscience not as glory, but as question. Yet many admired Clive's composure. They saw in him the perfect symbol of Britain's new identity, practical, ruthless, disciplined. The very qualities that had won Bengal seemed to embody a new national creed. That order, even when unjust, was better than chaos. Empire, they argued, was not theft, but responsibility. This moral inversion, where domination became duty, would define British imperial thought for centuries. Clive himself seemed torn between two realities. In public, he defended his actions with cold clarity. In private, he wrestled with despair. His correspondence reveals flashes of guilt, moments where the memory of Bengal's suffering pierced his composure. "We have achieved greatness," he wrote to a friend, "but at a price we cannot yet measure." He withdrew from public life, retreating to his estate, where wealth brought no peace. In 1774, he took his own life, the same man who years earlier had survived his first attempt with a misfired pistol. His death marked more than a personal tragedy. It was the symbolic end of Britain's innocence in the empire. The nation mourned him as a hero, but whispered of him as a warning. In the years that followed, Parliament tightened its grip on the East India Company. The Regulating Act of 1773 created oversight, placing governors in India under direct supervision of London. It was an early attempt to reconcile profit with principle, power with conscience. But the contradiction remained unresolved. The company's officials still ruled in the name of commerce, still taxed and traded with impunity. The debate that began with Clive would echo through Britain's future, through reformers like Edmund Burke and critics who would one day call empire a great delusion. For beneath the surface of triumph, a deeper truth had begun to form, that conquest abroad reshapes the conqueror at home. The empire that began in Bengal was no longer a distant adventure. It was a mirror reflecting Britain's wealth, ambition, and moral uncertainty. The Parliament that had once cheered its victories now debated its consequences. And in that chamber, between applause and unease, a nation began to glimpse its own shadow. The empire that began in Bengal would one day collapse under the weight of its own conscience. But for now, its heartbeat echoed not in the fields of India, but in the halls of Westminster, where pride and guilt sat side by side. The fields of Plassey lie quiet now. The mango groves have thinned, the air hums with cicadas, and the Bhagirathi River moves lazily through its bends. Yet beneath the roots of the old banyan tree, the same under which Clive once stood, the soil still holds the memory of that morning when the fate of two nations was rewritten. The birds sing, the farmers work, and time seems to have healed the land. But history is never silent. It lingers, in memory, in consequence, in the stories nations tell themselves to live with what they have done. The East India Company's victory at Plassey was small in scale, a skirmish of a few hours, fought by a few thousand men. Yet it became the fulcrum on which global history turned. From that single act of betrayal and calculation emerged 2 centuries of British rule in India. Within a decade, the company would expand its reach beyond Bengal, swallowing territories through treaty and threat. India's ancient courts and kingdoms fell one by one, not to invasion, but to administration. An army of clerks, surveyors, and soldiers mapped, taxed, and redefined an entire civilization in the image of trade. But in the beginning, it was only a corporation, and in the end, it behaved as one. The plunder of Bengal financed Britain's industrial revolution. Its textiles and taxes built the banks, ships, and mills that powered an empire. The wealth of Calcutta flowed through London's streets, gilding its buildings and funding its wars. And yet, the human cost, the hunger, the dislocation, the slow erosion of dignity remained largely invisible to those who profited from it. The empire, like all power, learned to forget where it began. By the 19th century, the British no longer spoke of the East India Company. They spoke of the Raj, a moral empire, one that justified its rule as a civilizing mission. The language had changed. The logic had not. The wound of Plassey was covered with the rhetoric of progress. The conqueror had found his conscience, but too late. Still, the memory of that first betrayal never vanished from Indian minds. Bengali poets, reformers, and revolutionaries returned to Plassey as to a sacred site, not of glory, but of warning. To them, it symbolized both the origin of subjugation and the beginning of resistance. The ghosts of Siraj-ud-Dowlah and Mir Jafar haunted every debate about loyalty, courage, and freedom. When Indian nationalists later rallied under the banner of self-rule, they spoke of 1757 not as distant history, but as a living scar. Even the landscape seemed to remember. British officers stationed near Plassey in the 19th century recorded strange unease at the site. The sense, one wrote, that the ground itself resents us. Whether superstition or truth, it revealed something deeper, that moral memory cannot be conquered, only carried. In Britain too the reckoning grew. The parliamentary inquiries that had once questioned Clive's fortune evolved into a larger moral conversation about the purpose of the empire itself. Was Britain the guardian of civilization, or the inheritor of conquest? The Victorians preferred the former. The 20th century forced them to confront the latter. When the empire finally began to crumble, and India won independence in 1947, it was as though the silence beneath the banyan tree had finally spoken. Yet, even in independence, the shadows of Plassey remained. The structures the company built, bureaucracy, law, taxation, centralized authority, endured in both nations. The habits of power, once forged in secrecy and profit, outlived the empire itself. Bengal's fields had been plundered, but its legacy had become the foundation of two modern states, each still negotiating the balance between sovereignty and memory, ambition and morality. The banyan tree at Plassey still stands. Its roots twist through centuries of earth. Its branches spread wide enough to shade the ghosts of all who fell there. The soldiers, the clerks, the peasants, the prince who trusted too easily, and the merchant who doubted too late. Locals say the tree hums when the monsoon wind rises, as though remembering the drumbeats that once rolled across its fields. To stand beneath it is to feel the uneasy weight of inheritance, not just Indian or British, but human, because empire at its heart is a story about people, their fears, their choices, their capacity for self-deception. It begins with the illusion of control and ends with the discovery of consequence. The East India Company sought profit. It found power. Britain sought glory. It found guilt. India sought freedom. It found the memory of what had been lost. The ghost of Plassey is not the sound of cannon or the shadow of soldiers. It is the whisper that asks whether civilization can be built upon injustice, and whether history ever truly forgives the hand that wounds in the name of order. Every empire carries the shadow of its first injustice, and every nation must one day face what it once called destiny. For the banyan still stands, and beneath its roots, the silence of that morning continues to speak.